The murder of David Holden, who was the chief foreign correspondent of the Sunday Times, has remained a mystery for decades.
Holden was picked up at the airport after landing in Cairo to cover a peace conference, and he was shot once to the heart. His body was found dumped in the dirt next to a busy road close to the airport, and he was stripped of all means of identification.
This was a very serious professional hit. At the time of Holden's murder, I was working for the Sunday Times investigative team, and I was one of the journalists who Harry Evans sent to the Middle East immediately after Holden's murder. We very quickly found ourselves in a very murky world indeed. It was one of spies and counter-spies, and sometimes we felt those mysterious figures were much closer to us than we really wanted.
There were so many mysteries in Holden's life. Was the CIA involved in any way, or was it perhaps the KGB, the Soviet Secret Service? This was the team that had cracked some of the biggest cases of its time, but in this case they failed. The editor of the Sunday Times at that time was Harold Evans. Harry Evans was obsessed with this case until his very last days.
Shortly before he died in 2020, I saw him actually on 2 occasions, and each time he said, "Peter, it's the great regret of my journalistic life that we never found out who killed David Holden. It took us almost 50 years to crack the case, find out who killed David Holden and why."
Terribly difficult to say. When I was last there...
David Holden was the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times in the 1960s and 1970s. Holden started his career as a journalist in London at the Times in 1954. But within 3 months, he was sent abroad to become a foreign correspondent. His sudden rise within the newspaper was puzzling.
To all appearances, David Holden was a very smooth, accomplished, professional foreign correspondent. One of the most notable things was an apparent gift of being in the right place at the right time. So many times he seemed to know what was going to happen before it did happen.
To wildly enthusiastic crowds, President Nasser announced that Egypt had taken over the Suez Canal.
The Suez Crisis, the Congo, the Yemen, and in particular the coup that unseated Allende in Chile in 1973, which made us wonder who was tipping him off.
I don't suppose you've ever heard of Dmitry Blagaov or Georgy Kirkov?
The journalist found many inconsistencies in his life and his career.
One of the most disturbing stories we heard came from the great photographer Don McCullin.
I was in Uganda during Idi Amin's reign, and there was a man called David Holden. He fled, and a couple of days later I realized why he fled, because he knew there was a coup coming across the Tanzania border.
Holden got out just in time before McCullin and a number of his journalistic and photographic colleagues were captured, and McCullin was incensed. He thought that Holden had got away, looked after himself, and hadn't tipped off any of his colleagues about the danger they were in.
How did he possibly know what was coming? Had he been tipped off, and by whom?
I should like always to see this, that the peace process in momentum, whatever happens.
Holden was probably the only journalist killed while reporting peace, and this is what really puzzled Harry Evans.
Harry Evans dispatched 6 journalists in all from London, and I was one of the 6, and I spent the first week after Holden's murder in Amman, the capital of Jordan, where he'd spent 4 days on that final trip.
This was the team that had cracked some of the biggest mysteries of its time, but the Holden case was by far the most unsettling.
Who killed Holden and why? It turned out that those were the key questions that underlay the whole inquiry for as long as it went on. What we tried to do in that first week was simply to reconstruct everything he'd done, who he'd seen, where he'd been. What was interesting, in particular in Amman, was there were periods of his stay there that we couldn't account for. There were some gaps that we simply could not fill.
Sometimes Holden appeared to be in 2 places at the same time.
One of the most telling concerned a postcard which Holden sent the day before he died to a friend, which had a picture of a fortress, and on the other side he wrote, "In the Middle East, citadels still have their uses." But at the very same time he was sending it, he was supposedly miles away in the occupied West Bank, interviewing a Palestinian about the nature of the occupation.
The team soon started to wonder, was Holden more than just a foreign correspondent? Was he more than just a journalist? Holden was due to fly to Cairo to cover an important peace conference, but as soon as he landed in Cairo, he disappeared.
His body was found the next morning. All identification had been stripped from his clothing. He'd been shot with a single bullet to the heart from the back and dumped in the dirt by a roadside near the airport. The Sunday Times was soon aware that he was missing, but had no idea where he was. And it wasn't until the Saturday, that's 3 days later, that someone found his body in the mortuary.
As I recall, it was on a trolley in a refrigerated cupboard, and it was pulled out. I lifted to see that Ed showed us the bullet. My experience is that you don't get shot in the back by accident.
One of the main findings of the new investigation was that Holden had been targeted at least 3 years before he was actually killed. In 1974, a Canadian journalist named David Holden went to Cairo and had a near miss with the same people who we think killed Holden 3 years later.
I arrived in Cairo airport. I go through customs, and these two gentlemen are there saying, "Are you David Holden?" I said, "David Holden?" I said, "Yes, I am." I said, "We're from the Foreign Ministry Press Division. We're here to meet you and take you to your hotel." And so we climbed in their car, and halfway to Cairo, I said, "How did you know I was coming?" And they said, "Well, we were here to meet David Holden." And I said, "Well, I'm actually David Halton." "Oh," they said, and they then said, "Well, we're halfway to your hotel now, so we'll drive you there anyway."
Who knew that Holden was coming to Cairo? And why were his killers out to get him? A startling discovery in London was that messages that Holden had sent to the Sunday Times, as well as messages that the investigations team in the Middle East had been sending back to the office, had been stolen.
That was a very troubling moment and made us realise that we were into very deep waters indeed. Everything was getting very sinister. Harry Evans decided we had to expand the inquiry to cover not just Holden's last week of his life, but the whole of his life. What was it in his life that might produce answers to the insistent questions that were still troubling us? One of the things we found out was that very few people seemed to know him closely. They all said he was an enigma, he was remote.
He seemed to be this sort of opaque, elusive figure who was on to his next assignment and didn't really bond with anyone. Holden had initially wanted to become an actor before he became a journalist, and his entire life seemed like he was playing a part. Shortly after I joined the Sunday Times in 2020, Harry Evans died. I knew Peter Gillman. He trained me in investigative journalism, and when Harry Evans died, I emailed Peter to express my condolences. In his reply, Gillman mentioned Evans' dying wish to solve the Holden case.
I took Harry's words to heart. This hadn't been solved, and I still wanted to be solved.
This was a big investigation. It was a cold case. It was a murder mystery, and I was intrigued, so I started to do some digging. The investigation was a mix of all the new techniques, from doorstepping sources to going to the archives to try and find documents to support our theories and suspicions.
For an old-timer like me, the new investigation was a revelation, because Manu was on top of all the new digital methods of research that weren't around at all in my day.
Had he been recruited by the British Secret Service, MI6, when he was a student at Cambridge? Was it the CIA that had recruited him when he was a student in the US? Or was he perhaps recruited by the KGB, the Soviet Secret Service? Gillman had many suspicions about some of the key characters involved, but he couldn't prove it. It took us more than 40 years to actually find the documents that could verify those suspicions, that could stack up the old theory. The inside team had found out that he had this secret gay relationship for 10 years. Possibly the biggest reveal of the new investigation was that his lover, a guy named Leo Silberman, had been in fact a Soviet spy and the KGB recruiter. Another major thing that we could confirm was that most of the people that Holden had met during his last trip were somehow connected to the CIA, if not straight on the agency's payroll.
One of the most remarkable instances we came across was an apparent confession by Holden that he'd been spying for the KGB. He told that to an academic colleague and friend who kept quiet about it until shortly before he himself died, and we thought it was possibly the most telling thing we discovered of all. We've cracked it.
We found that Holden was not just a spy. He was in fact a double agent. He was working for 2 intelligence agencies.
The Egyptian Secret Service killed Holden.
The reason for the killing was to be found in a major shift in global politics, where the CIA and the KGB were fighting off dominance over the Middle East.
Holden was some kind of double agent. He was judged to have been a traitor, and that's why he had to die.
David Holden didn't want to go to Egypt. We think he knew that he was going to walk into a trap, and that's the reason why he initially refused. But he changed his mind, and that cost him his life.
One of the most shocking things for me at the end of this long double investigation is the extent to which the worlds of intelligence and journalism were mixed. During our research, and it's possibly a wake-up call for me, we discovered that it wasn't that unusual for journalists to double up as spies. We found quite a number who'd been on the staff of the Sunday Times from an early stage who were operating in both spheres. Ian Fleming, that's the man who wrote all the James Bond novels, was the foreign editor of the Sunday Times after the Second World War. He had connections with intelligence and he saw no problem about recruiting people who would work as both spies and journalists at the same time.
The man who hired David Holden had been personally appointed by Fleming.
Maybe it's a degree of self-knowledge I've come to that other people were prepared to operate in ways which I thought betrayed the whole nature of journalism. So that makes you, I think you might say, sadder and wiser. I feel we've resolved the mystery for Harry, and it's exactly what he wanted.